Thank you so much, everyone. And yeah, thank you for your attention. And it's an absolute honor to be invited to speak as a keynote presentation. So yeah, thank you all for coming. Hopefully this will be interesting. I apologize in advance for my thick accent, but hopefully the pictures will do the talking where you don't understand what I'm saying. Yeah, so let's get cracking. So thank you for the introduction, Julia. Today I'll be talking about sharing healthcare research with comics. So I've been really lucky in the last couple of years since I came to New Zealand. I've been working on a medical doctorate in clinical research, looking at how we can use comics in different aspects of clinical research and care. And I'm going to try and touch on a whole bunch of that and how it relates to medical art as we go. So yeah, let's just get started. There we go. So the plan for the talk, I'm going to kind of cover these four little areas. So first of all, a little bit about where comics fit into medicine and medical art. Talk a little bit about my own background and how I've come to make art the way that I do. Spend most of the talk giving you lots and lots of examples of different ways comics can be used to support clinical research and care. And then we'll have some time for questions at the end if anyone wants to, or you can escape early if that makes more sense. So the first bit, where do comics fit into medicine and medical art? So here are some examples of my own medical art, which you may or may not be familiar with, but the kind of work I do ranges from more technical medical illustration up to very abstract and conceptual work. And I love working across the spectrum of what medical art can be. And where, yeah, a lot of the things I do might be very busy, detailed illustrations where there's a lot thrown at you at once. Something that we do a lot of in medicine or medical illustration is showing change over time. So here's an example of some of the anatomy of the hand in health and in advanced rheumatoid arthritis. So using medical illustration to kind of show change over time, before and after health and disease. And if you push that idea just a little bit further, you can tell a little bit more of a story. You can communicate a sequence of events. And that's when we start to push into graphic medicine or the overlap of medicine and comics. So here you can see that there's a broken leg, and that environment's really pro-inflammatory. And so it's very, clots can be provoked and happen in the leg, the lower limb. And if one of those clots breaks off, the vessels of the leg get bigger and bigger until you reach the heart, and then get smaller and smaller as you enter the lungs. So it's really common that when a clot breaks off from the leg, the place that it tends to get stuck is in the lungs. And so here with a couple of visuals and a little bit of text, we can kind of try and communicate that story of how a broken leg can lead to a clot in the lungs. And we do these things all the time. We show the progression of a pathology, for example, here in how fatty buildup within an artery eventually leads to a clot formation and what provokes a heart attack. And then for those who've dabbled in surgical illustration or surgical sequences, essentially a sequence of steps in a surgery is the basic parts of a comic as well. So this isn't a new or weird or wonderful idea I've come up with. It's a very common way that we try to share information already using comics. So I want to give lots of examples so maybe excuse me. These have been some more technical examples of almost kind of literally showing how a pathology can build up and lead to something else. But also comics are fantastic for more conceptual or difficult to communicate ideas. So here's a little example of a comic trying to explain about how we give oxygen in clinical practice. So oxygen is one of the most commonly prescribed medicines that we have. And that's because all of the cells in our body require oxygen to live. They'll suffocate essentially without it. And we know that if you don't get enough oxygen, that leads to things like heart attacks and strokes. So it's very important that we get enough oxygen, and sometimes you supplement that in care. But when our cells process oxygen, they create these little toxic puts called free radicals. And it's really important that those get mopped up so it doesn't cause damage to the surrounding tissues. Now, if we give too much oxygen, there are too much of these toxic puts, and that can cause damage also, leading to things that you see here. So both too much and too little oxygen is a problem in healthcare. And so there's this concept of swimming between the flags, or trying to keep the oxygen within quite a narrow range that's enough to give you what you need, but not too much to cause problems on that other end. So that's just a little example about a more conceptual way of explaining an aspect of how we care for people in hospital. But I'm going to wind the clock back a little bit here to, I guess, a little bit more about me and my not so exciting origin story for, what's led me to look at medical art the way that I do. And I think it all zooms back to when I was about 15. This is before hair scissors were invented, clearly. This is me and my baby brother, who are quite a number of years apart. Whenever he was about 2, about to turn 3, he was diagnosed with dedifferentiated clival chordoma with pulmonary metastasis. And unless you're really familiar with niche medicine, that none of those words mean anything to basically anybody. Even the medical experts who were looking after him, these terms, they weren't familiar with the diagnosis, how it's supposed to be treated. But I was basically put in a bath of fire for trying to navigate medical academic texts, medical materials that just weren't made for everybody else, or for the patients and families that need to use them. And throughout his kind of battle with cancer, me and my whole family became really intimately familiar with just how impenetrable medical language and materials are, especially for the public. But this, experience over about 5 years of his battle sparked a passion for trying to make medicine more accessible, and art is the medium that I choose to do that with. And so everything that I do is about trying to just make medicine easier, more accessible for everybody that needs to know about it, because there are far more people than academic or medical experts and doctors that need to use this medical knowledge. And it's a privilege to be able to share some of that as a medical artist now in my current role. So a little bit about how I see my job as a medical illustrator. I consider every time I go to create a piece, it's a little bit of a journey, or it's a heck of a journey. And while I've had the privilege now of a medical education, and I can understand some of the materials in terms of medical textbooks, academic papers, clinical imaging and things, I'm by no means an expert in any one of these areas. And I struggle to understand this. And every time I work with someone who's much smarter than me at one of these medical topics to help share their science, there are a lot of pitfalls for me to fall into. But eventually, and all of you will be able to relate to this moment, there's this really special point whenever you have done your homework, you've read into an idea, you've talked with enough people, and finally that scientific idea just clicks, that you get it. And for a really brief moment in time, you become the person in the world who is most familiar with what it's like to go from not understanding an idea to understanding it. And that's a really, really special place that we get to play in. We turn around and we try to craft an easier path to that knowledge for the people that come after us. And you can think of your art like stepping stones for the people that come next. You're just trying to make their journey slightly easier than the one you have to take. And while I've got this little character on the screen, you might notice as I go through my work that she is recurring through most of the work that I do. So this is my wonderful wife, who's always the smart one whenever both of us appear in comics together. And she's a public health doctor and absolutely amazing person. So a little shout out there, but keep an eye out for her because she appears everywhere. Let's move on to just looking at where comics can be used across the spectrum of clinical research. And we're going to start at the very beginning, kind of try and work through it logically. With public engagement. So whenever I started working with the Medical Research Institute of New Zealand, I got really involved in their social media outreach to try and share their research and to let people know about the studies that were going on and the results of those studies, engaging with people on social media. And so I worked a lot with all different sorts of the graphics that I know how to make, comics, data visualization, animation, graphic design, medical illustration, just trying to see what stuck, what do people actually engage with or react with in terms of a public audience. And what I found looking at the data over about 5 years of before me and with me was that comics were the most, well, I'll show you the data. Comics both reached the most people compared to any other type of social media post or any type of graphic used in a post. And they also engaged the greatest proportion of people that they reached. So it was a twofold win, which I thought was really interesting because, as I said, my background in medical illustration, I would have thought maybe that was my stronger skill set. So it was really surprising. But over the last couple of years, this idea has just been reinforced and reinforced that it can be a super effective way of communicating science. So whenever the pandemic hit, I started seeing a lot more science comics, graphic medicine, both locally here in New Zealand and across the world. These are just two little publications that I wrote about that feat. The lower one was, you can take a peek on the Journal of Visual Communication and Medicine, if you like. That's where a lot of artists were very generous in letting me share some wonderful examples that they had done of communicating public health science through the pandemic. But what I saw that I tied to comics or give them the credit for is terms like social distancing, flatten the curve, healthcare saturation, quarantine, immunity, all these words that were the realm of scientists in not that long ago have become public. It's language that all of us are quite familiar with now, unfortunately, thanks to the pandemic. But one of the comic examples that for me has been an absolute inspiration was the COVID-19 Chronicles. If anyone's familiar with them, if you're not, go check them out. They are incredible. Currently, it's a set of 146 comics, which have been produced by the National University Singapore Medical School. And it's a collaboration between healthcare experts, for example, Dale Fisher in infectious diseases, between artists Andrew Tan and Angie Neo, and also social media teams from the university itself. So it's this idea of a bunch of people who each have their specialisms getting together to try and share information about the pandemic, both the evolving science and the evolving countermeasures from public health, trying to share those with the public audience in an engaging way. And just the speed that these guys worked was incredible. And now I'll probably ruin it by explaining it, but every single comic had this really cool 6-panel format where the first panel kind of set the title, which kind of set how you were going to interpret the panels that followed. The panels were often comical or a little story over 4 panels. And here you can see talking about unsung heroes and then seeing all these doctors doing very doctory things. How cool. And at the very end, a scientific expert will make a comment that often changes how you interpret everything you just saw. So in this case, they point out that the real heroes are in the background of all the panels, and it's the cleaners, the porters, the cooks. And I don't know if it's as profound whenever I explain it like this to you, but this really had an impact on me and just showed me how amazing this medium can be. We often work with pictures on their own, and academics often work with text on their own. But whenever you combine them together and you plot them in a sequence, you can weave them together into a story, and they can often do more than the sum of their parts. So it's a difficult medium to work in, but it's more than the technical quality of the art or the writing. There's some really special things comics can do. And this is a little example of a very famous graphic, at least within New Zealand. There's a collaboration between artist Toby Morris and scientist Professor Susie Wiles. And they created a lot of animated comics to explain aspects of the pandemic as well. And they were both used by our government to try and help promote these messages. The WHO picked up a lot of them and has distributed them in many languages throughout the world. And interestingly, they released all of the art in the public domain so that people can share it as far as needed, which is quite unusual in our kind of profession. But obviously in a pandemic situation, it's been invaluable. And of course, I don't rate my own work anywhere near the two that I've just mentioned, but I too, and with the help of my wonderful wife as well, tried to share some information about pandemic science as it was evolving. So that's a little bit about trying to engage people with science who may not typically engage with it in the first place, but pushing that further towards the sort of things that are important in healthcare research. So research is generally done with small samples of people who hopefully represent a wider group of people. such as everyone with asthma, so that the discoveries that you make in the smaller group can apply to everyone without you needing to actually study every single person in that population. So it's really important that researchers can reach and engage representative populations. And part of that is advertising or sharing research, sharing the fact that research is going on so that people can decide if it's right for them. So Google pumps out about 30 billion advertisements per day into the world, Google alone, that is. The average person is thought to see between 4,000 and 10,000 advertisements. That's insane, the competition for your attention in the modern world. Pictures, comics, any form of visuals that we make, they can often cut through the noise of especially text-based advertising and means. And really your goal isn't to reach the maximum number of people, but it's really to try and engage relevant people. It's not about bothering everyone until someone gives up and reads your material or looks at it, but you're just trying to reach someone who actually wants to engage with your material. And pictures can be a useful way to cut through that noise. So for example, here we have a blue inhaler, super common way of treating asthma. So most people whose lives have been touched by asthma will have seen an inhaler like this before. And in this case, it's peeled apart and there's a conceptual representation of the drug that this inhaler contains in here. So maybe getting the attention of people whose lives have been touched by asthma, but also leaving some, trying to pique curiosity because you want them to take a further step to maybe learn a bit more if they are interested. So it's a kind of gentle way that isn't too much stealing someone's attention or forcing them into information they don't want to see, but just a gentle, if you're interested, read on. And so I've designed lots of different graphics to try and advertise studies. To try and reach these audiences that might be interested. For example, here is for an exergaming study. So sending people virtual reality kits, let them try out some exer games and then seeing if you can tie that to health outcomes. Again, you're not trying to give them all the information, you're just trying to pique their curiosity. And of course, you can deal with more serious topics as well. So this example is art designed to help share an online survey of intensive care staff in Australia and New Zealand to try and learn more about their experiences of harassment at work. And whenever these requests for someone to take part in a survey come in, you're asking someone to give up their time and take part in research. And often it can be a better approach to try and show that you appreciate the situation that they're coming from. And that you empathize with what's going on and you want to help be a part of a solution. And so comics can be a useful way to touch on these more serious issues. And speaking of that, here was a little case study that I'd published where we showed on a local scale for recruitment to qualitative research that showed some objective engagement and recruitment support using a comic-based approach to advertise a study. So Maori are the indigenous peoples of Aotearoa in New Zealand, and unfortunately are now a minority population thanks to aggressive colonization over here. And like many minority populations, they live in healthcare systems that haven't been built for them, don't accommodate them properly, and so they continue to face health inequity and far worse outcomes than non-Maori. So it's a massive problem over here in New Zealand, and similar ideas can be translated to other environments as well. But what we found with this study was that we were able to recruit 5 times the population of Maori in the local area, or 5 times the proportion, that fulfills a thing called equal explanatory power, which means rather than just trying to be representative of an underserved population, that you actually try to over-recruit that population, so you generate more data that can not just represent them, but hopefully lead to change in healthcare outcomes. So the animated comic, to get people's attention in the first place, to try and engage people with the study, was only a small part of why that was successful. But we think some of the reasons that might be is, one, you're not advertising using institutional logos and affiliations that might build trust in one audience, but whenever they're distrusted by particular audiences because of the experiences they've had in healthcare, that might not be the best approach for everyone. But also this little comic is not representing any particular demographic, so it's not singling out that we want this kind of a person or don't want that kind of a person, either intentionally or by accident. And these little anthropomorphic lungs kind of could represent anybody that has asthma. And you can project, and because they're relating to the experience that should be familiar with anyone who has the condition, people can relate to them quite broadly. And also you're respecting their mana, their experiences in the type of study design by acknowledging that the patients with chronic conditions are really the experts, not the medical professionals. But basically, this showed that comics could be effective on kind of a local or a small scale. And I was fortunate, or the world was unfortunate enough, that whenever the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and we all went into lockdown over here in New Zealand, all of our portfolio of research at the Institute was shut down, essentially, and we moved to trying to take on a bunch of COVID-19 studies to contribute with the kind of skill set that we had. And one of the things we wanted to do was to establish the makeup of the bubbles people were living in. And that's a term used here to mean the household units that people were living in, to learn things like where the proportion of vulnerable people who had people leaving their bubbles for essential work, how many times do people need to leave the home for shopping and that sort of thing, potentially exposing themselves to risk. But I was able to work with the research team that was leading that study and do what's called an embedded trial within the main trial. And so I tested two different approaches of conducting this survey-based research. The one on the left here is where we took the standard approach, where you try to appeal to altruism, where you're saying, please, can you please give us some information? We'll analyze it as professionals, we'll publish it in academic spaces, and hopefully it'll lead to some good down the line. And we pitted that against an approach that was all about trying to serve the participant, the person that gave their time to take part in the study. So the angle we took with that second approach was using this kind of almost gamified approach, saying, how does your information compare to everyone else's? Let's find out. So take part in this study. So the whole survey was illustrated with little cartoon characters that tried to represent the broad demographics of our wonderful little country. And then at the very end, you were given it's very simple, but a dynamic comic was presented that showed how your data compared to everyone else who'd taken part. And we found that this was a much more engaging approach. And overall, we managed to reach nearly 19,000 people, or rather not reach, we got nearly 19,000 results within 6 days for about $500 New Zealand dollars of ad spend, which if you've done any survey-based research, those numbers are insane. So it was really, really effective. And it was also interesting within the breakdown of the people who took part. It was a much more gender and ethnic diverse group of people within this illustrated approach. So this was really cool for kind of showing that comics can be useful for supporting actual research conduct as well as advertising, and on a national scale as well as a local one. So if we move to the next stage of a lot of research, when you've appealed to when you got someone's attention, the next step is really communicating what your study is all about, so they can decide, is this right for me or my family? So I've been designing lots of kind of poster-based sort of illustrated resources to try and get the word out about different studies, which were used in all sorts of environments like clinics and hospital notice boards. But what I noticed over time through my research work was that my work started to lean more and more on comics and comic-like graphics. So on the left here, you can see some graphics for intensive care staff, where using little comic iconographic illustrations to help them quickly understand what sort of patients are suitable for a study or not. And in the middle and the right were more patient-facing and public-facing examples where aspects of the study design was being explained through comic panels, and also showing what we meant when we talked about the sort of procedures someone would undergo, such as ultrasound of the shoulder on the right. So things that people wouldn't necessarily be familiar with, but at a glance, you can get a flavor of what the study is about and decide if it's worth your time to learn more about it. And all of this kind of reminded me of some research that I'd been doing, that I'd done in the past when I was still living and working in Scotland, where I'd done a study with general surgery patients who were undergoing elective procedures at a tertiary hospital. And I looked at the sort of materials that were used to prepare them for surgery, so that the surgeons have to explain the problem and the potential surgical solution to these patients. And what we found was a lot of them were using visual materials to do that. And those ranged from little drawings and sketches that they made, leaflets with professional illustration in them, pictures from textbooks, radiology, like a whole mix of visuals. And what we found is most patients received some form of visual to support their understanding and decision about surgery, but also that the more complicated the procedure was, the more they valued this sort of visual support when deciding about if surgery was right for them. And what's interesting here between the kind of green and the yellow bars is that surgeons' drawings were about as effective as all the other forms of media. Now, the differences between them isn't significant, so you can treat them as about the same. But that's really interesting because surgeons' drawings tend to be extremely rough, made on the back of any scrap of paper you've got. They're not necessarily anatomical, and they, but yeah. So this is a little comic to try and explain how drawings were used in surgery. And you can see here that the drawing evolves over time. So the amount of information that you can fire at a patient per second is limited by the rate that a surgeon can draw. And because they have to draw in a clinical environment, they don't have all day to make it. And so the detail they can pump into that drawing is also extremely limited. And the drawing evolves over time, being erased or new bits being added and so on. And what you end up with essentially translates very well into what a comic is. You're breaking down a complex idea over time in a series of panels to explain it. And so with that in mind, I found that when I was developing the materials to explain studies, I was leaning more and more on comics to try and communicate certain aspects of the study design or the problems that people might face that would make them relevant or eligible for the study. For example, trying to explain acne here, a little mix of comic and medical illustration almost. So trying to explain that this blue liquid coming out of the sweat gland here is called sebum, and it's oily, keeps the skin waterproof, and it helps lift dead skin cells out of the pore and away. But in the case of whenever we're teenagers or unfortunate in life with the differences in hormones and things, increased shedding of those skin cells or increased production of sebum means that they can get stuck and clog up pores. And then the natural bacteria that are within the skin whenever they're within this stagnant material, they can multiply and lead to these little pustules that we know as acne. And when you have a lot of these over a long period of time, that can lead to permanent scarring. So I was trying to support these resources that were helping people decide if taking part in a study might be right for them. But the way I kind of think about it is I don't care if they take part or not. My job is just to give people the information and let them decide if it's right for them. And always trying to be useful and trying to be generous with what you share with people, trying to think about what's useful for them rather than what's useful for the research team is a nice way to approach that. And so, these are just more examples from other skin product-based studies. But here's an example of sharing, whether or not a child takes part in the study. Here are the things that a parent should look out for that would suggest the child's becoming more unwell. And so this sort of information is useful regardless of whether you take part in the trial. Again, tips about trying to stop this little skin infection from spreading within the household or to other children as well. But these are examples of using some comic graphics within an information resource. But if anyone's familiar with clinical trials, the information resources themselves tend to be between 12 and 20 pages long. They are dense in text, and their trials over time have shown that the average length of these documents is going up, and the amount of understanding people have of them is going down. And this is completely the wrong direction. So people's response to, people don't understand my trial enough, is shove more information at them, and it's clearly not the right way to go. So a randomized controlled trial that I've embedded within a randomized controlled trial called the CARE study, happening in New Zealand at the moment, is where I've taken that dense amount of information and I've tried to condense it into a 2-page comic to support to support parents and their children understanding what this asthma trial is all about. And again, I'm visualizing the sort of procedures that they'll take part in. I'm showing them the good things and the bad things about being in the study, what to do if there's a problem, and so on. And the kind of hope here is that when we provide people with this comic prefaced information, my hypothesis is that the parents will read more and retain more of that information. The children will read more and retain more of that information, and it'll help the parents explain the study to their children at a level that's appropriate for their developmental stage and what's appropriate within that household. So stay tuned for those results. Hopefully that'll be ready to publish at some point early next year. So we've gotten to the point where we've talked about people coming into clinical trials, understanding that trial and making the decision if it's right for them. And so the next kind of stage of research is the actual conduct of a trial or actual patient care. And so there's another trial happening over here called the AIR algorithm study. And I once again have leached on to a cool study and tried to embed my comics research within that in the real world. So I've designed some interactive tutorials to teach patients about asthma and about how different treatments work to help them learn how to self-manage their own treatments so that they don't have to go through GPs and hospitals and so on to make small changes to their treatment whenever their symptoms change on a day-to-day basis. So here's a small excerpt of what some of that material looks like. So we talk about, or we introduce asthma as a problem where the lungs are particularly sensitive to triggers such as cold or pollen. And then by sensitive, we mean that the immune cells within the lungs signal for more immune cells to come, and that leads to inflammation of the lungs in an attempt to protect them. Now, while inflammation and swelling is useful when you've broken a limb, it provides a nice cushion around a broken bone so that it can't sustain further injury as easily. But when you swell up the airways, it makes breathing really difficult. And whenever you have swelling over a long amount of time, that scars up the lungs and is a very bad thing. And so we have a way of dealing with that in the body. It's these tiny little glands that sit on top of the kidneys called the adrenal glands, and they produce a thing called corticosteroids, which put out inflammation. But the problem in asthma is that there's too much inflammation for them to handle on their own, particularly whenever you have an asthma attack or you're going through a flare. And so we can use inhalers with corticosteroids to support your natural response to settle that inflammation down. And that's just a tiny little excerpt about how you can kind of conceptually explain clinical treatment and care. And another little example for those who like animation are some of these animated panels, which I designed for a wonderful nerve surgeon called Mr. Tom Quick, based out of the UK. He works for Great Ormond Street Hospital. And he often, when he's trying to explain nerve injury to especially young patients and their parents, he uses the analogy of a fuse and dynamite for carrying signals along a cord where they have their function at the end. So whenever a nerve is mildly injured with like a bruise or a conduction block, the signal doesn't transmit. And he compares that to a puddle that stops a fuse from moving, or for a spark moving along a fuse and interrupting the signal. Now, while a puddle may evaporate on its own, it really depends on the conditions. And so sometimes you might need to support that with surgery, for example, to help that nerve recover. But once healed, that signal can flow again. And so that's a visualization of the sort of explanation he usually uses to try and augment that in a clinical setting. And then here's another example of a more significant nerve injury. The nerve will die off a bit like a worm beyond the point of the injury, but it also heals from that point, and it'll grow along that same path. And the way it knows which direction to grow is that nerves are surrounded by these little Schwann cells, the purple cells, and they throw out like a breadcrumb trail so that the nerve can grow by chemotaxis along that path. So again, it's all a bit conceptual, but some of these ideas don't mean a lot when you put them in words. And if you add a visual, if it's amusing or it's interesting, that might make it a little bit more memorable too. So we've gotten all the way through some clinical treatment, some clinical trials, and the next stage is trying to share the results of those trials. And so I've done lots of little experiments trying to condense these academic papers, which again can be dozens of pages long, into short form comics that try and visualize the ideas, make them a bit more approachable, and again act as this stepping stone into the more academic material for people that aren't medical experts. So I'll talk you through one little example of a recent one, collaborating with the Bristol Academic Respiratory Unit in the UK. And designed a comic which is all about aerosols. So we know that the the recommendations for people to stay 1 to 2 meters apart, that's based on the distance that a droplet particle can travel, and droplets rapidly fall to the ground. And then, and that happens within a fraction of a second or a few seconds. But aerosols are much, much tinier particles, which you can see in the purple bubble here. They can fit loads of COVID-19 in them also, but they can hover around in the air for ages. So medics have been terrified of aerosols spreading disease, especially within clinical environments. And that's led to a lot more heavy-duty personal protective equipment being used. That takes time to don off and on. It's led to deep cleaning procedures after surgery, for example, or when patients move between rooms, again, adding lots of time. And people have entirely avoided clinical procedures that aren't urgently necessary to save someone's life, but are useful for clinical care in case they generate aerosols that could spread COVID-19. And what that leads to is patients on elective waiting lists and so on, such as for a hip replacement, they're not getting the care that they really ought to have got, and these waiting lists are pushed and pushed and pushed. So this team decided to actually measure the amount of aerosol that are generated from different procedures using some fancy equipment that the university had developed. And what they looked at was people with and without COVID-19, whenever they were at rest, speaking with and without a mask, while coughing, and they investigated the aerosols generated from a whole bunch of different clinical procedures that were thought to generate lots of aerosol. And it's quite interesting what they found. They basically invalidated the whole idea that a procedure is aerosol generating, because all of these respiratory procedures generated the same amount or less aerosol than just sitting there breathing, doing nothing. But what they did find as well was that coughing by far generated the most aerosol. And so while a lot of the emphasis has been on how can we protect clinical people, for example, in ICU who are putting breathing tubes into people, whereas the real problem are the staff on the front line who are facing patients who are coughing and we don't know their COVID-19 status. So yeah, some interesting work, and a lot more accessible in this form than the several publications that were farmed out from the wonderful research. But again, the value of this work is I think it's useful. The people who hire me seem to think it's useful, and the people I work with, and that's great, but it's always good to put some data in there too. So the kind of closing piece of research that I'm doing as the body of work for my doctorate at the moment is that bubble study that I mentioned. I did a randomized crossover trial where we contacted everybody who took part, who said they'd be willing to take part in further research, and offered them 3 versions of the summary of what we found out from the study. So one was a scientific abstract, is kind of like a controlled. One was a lay summary, which is just like a more public-friendly text, which is the usual way we share study results. And the final version was a comic that illustrated all of the results in a highly visual way. Now, these results are provisional. The actual final data analysis still needs to go on, but the crude results from about 1,200 people showed kind of what we expected. Thank goodness, reassuring for the work put in. But yeah, the comic version of those results was the most preferred. Interestingly, some people did prefer the scientific version, which might have been less penetrable. So it'll be interesting to dig into the qualitative side of those results too. And a lot of what I've mentioned has been about how we can communicate with the public, but also this sort of material is useful in professional settings. So I wanted to mention about comics in academic spaces too, very briefly. So over the past year, I've been working for a journal called Radiographics, published by the Radiological Society of North America. And the editor, Professor Ciléin Kearns, has been incredibly supportive of my kind of weird visual style and approach. And I've been working with her to help introduce a new, totally visual section of the journal called Cases from the Cookie Jar. And with these, so medical imaging, like this head scan on the left, can be quite hard to interpret. Surgical photos and videos, again, they're very accurate, but it's hard to orientate and hard to understand what's going on, especially when you're new to the material. And so I've been using medical illustration and comics to kind of fill the gap between these forms of imaging to help medical professionals learn to interpret the imaging. And this is the sort of graphics that I've been producing. So I'm trying to tell stories, the stories of the science of the pathology for rare diseases where there's little textual information published and also very little graphics published in this highly visual way. And they're kind of a hybrid between medical illustration and comics. But they've all been very well received so far, and it's been an absolute privilege to be a part of. And I'm very lucky that they've just recently appointed me as the associate editor of medical illustration, which I think is a good sign that they want more of this in the future. So very encouraging. And yeah, some of them are quite silly and abstract, but if it gets the information across, that's what's important. So I've gone in a million different directions. Hopefully some of you are still awake. Thank you very much for your attention. But to summarize the ideas I've tried to share here, comics can be a really effective way to reach people and to engage people with medical science, to raise awareness of health information, public health information in particular, to communicate with public audiences about trials, to support patient and parent understanding so people can make an informed decision about whether surgery, care, a trial is right for them, to try and explain pathology and treatment so that people understand what's going on, how their treatment works, why it's important to take it, and so on, to facilitate those discussions. And to share the results of clinical research, because we know that clinical, especially with vaccines being a very recent example, scientists don't need to know, or they need to know this, but it's important that everybody knows how these things work, that knows that this evidence base is trustable, it's reliable. And if scientists don't take part in these conversations, the conversations happen without the scientists, and we all see how that leads to mis and disinformation, which is quite a scary world to be in. And yeah, all of these sorts of visuals are stepping stones to try and make science a little bit easier to understand for the person that comes after us. And a little hidden message that I haven't explicitly said throughout is really, if you're in this wonderful world of creating visuals to share science, have fun as well. It might make the materials a little bit more engaging for the people that are reading them, a little bit more interesting, a little bit more memorable, and also, you know, it's a privilege and a joy to be able to illustrate science. And so, really, at every opportunity that you can, where it's appropriate, have fun. And yes, this little rats that I absolutely adore in that illustration at the end of an article about different masks and how they protect us from COVID. So semi-final slide, general thoughts about comics in medicine. Fantastic for simplifying complex information. You can make subtle differences. You can accentuate them so they're much more obvious and clear for people not familiar with the science. Try to break up ideas and weave them into a story. It's the way we share information as people, and it's the way we remember things. Think about the viewer experience. Try to be useful. Try to be generous with what you're sharing. Experiment, you know, here's a bunch of ideas of what I've tried and what stuck for me, but it's by no means exhaustive. And yeah, have fun. Don't just look at what's been done, try new things and see what you can discover and achieve. And yeah, please have fun. It's as I said, it's a privilege to be able to share science with people, and there's a lot of fun to be had in what we do. So I will leave this slide up and let Julia and Roxy take over if there's any questions people have been asking. And yeah, feel free to shout out.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ciléin, for that beautiful presentation, visually, and also the words that you shared. I know I'm leaving this feeling really, really good about being part of this community and getting to do that. The work that we do, and remembering to have fun is a really, really important message too. So
thank you so much, Julia.
Welcome. So I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions. We had a few coming in the chat that I'm going to read back to you, and then we'll go from there. So we did have a question early in the presentation from Kevin Wee. And the question was, do you still have the survey open If so, could you share the link or artwork? And I'm not entirely sure what he was referring to, but hopefully maybe.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned 4 surveys in that. None of them are currently open. So this is all research that is either in the process of being analysed or published for the survey-based stuff. But thank you so much for your interest. That's very kind if you were willing to share your information in that.
All right. We have another question from the audience from Felix. The question is a comic design specific question. Do you have a particularly memorable application of comic layouts, so panels, gutters, flow, or bubbles, from other artists in medical comics / graphic medicine?
Yes, and I'm going to preface it with one thing to say is that it totally depends on the medium that you're trying to share your comics. So a lot of what I've shown have been digital comics shared in online and social media formats. So where you share it is really important for what sort of a layout might be appropriate, but also because it's so important nowadays to be able to share things in so many different places that if you remember the COVID-19 Chronicles, that 6-panel square format layout, that's a really adaptable format. For example, Instagram swiping across through a series of squares, vertical layout for things like tapas and webtoons, and the way things are presented in websites and to be viewed on the mobile phone. And what's suitable for those sort of resources, those are the sort of things that you're playing with whenever it comes to what's suitable. What is going to be the most distributable amongst the ways you want to distribute your material. And then, of course, if you're printing something on paper where you have a double fold spread of pages, you can do clever things with how one page relates to the other, as well as left panels relate to right panels and so on. So yeah, with the caveat that it totally depends on where it's going, what's most appropriate. And it's a very simple layout, but one particular comic that I really like, I can't remember the name of the example, unfortunately, but it was explaining how I think all of the top panels in a sequence showed how someone was going about their day and answering questions like, how are you, and how they were experiencing things on the outside, whereas all of the bottom panels showed what was going on internally. And as you jump between them, you got a completely different picture between their internal world and how they were struggling versus that external one. And yeah, just things like that are difficult to put into words or to share with single images and the like. So I thought that was a cool use of comics. But yeah, I would certainly say if you want a well of inspiration or ideas, check out the COVID-19 Chronicles, because within that limited format, they've done a lot of fun things with trying to share science with comics.
Amazing, thank you. We have another question from the audience, actually a fair few. The next one in line is from Paul Kelly. Paul wonders, if you had unlimited resources to do so, what self-led project would you want to launch?
Oh my goodness, I have too many projects that I want to launch. I'll be greedy and take 2. One is some of my illustrated symptom differentials, where I try and take a really common symptom like headache or chest pain, and I try and show all of the pathology, all of the red flag important pathology that can cause that in the one illustration. And it's kind of both abstract as reference material and just fun for me to build these kind of Wimmer build complex illustrations. I love doing that. I'd love to make a textbook of that weird medical art style. And that's one idea parked. And then the other, I'd really love to do a graphic novel kind of talking about a lot of the things I learned along the way, particularly with my own baby brother and that journey. But I see every bit of comic that I make as preparing me for that journey, because that's a hell of a project. But yeah, one day, that's what I look forward to. So fingers crossed, keep your eyes on it.
Those sound really cool. We'll be on the lookout for one day.
One day.
We have another question from Avesta, and I think several people have this question actually. So first she says, thank you for the fantastic talk. And I think the use of graphics in research and clinical trials is super useful and something that many people in our field are interested in. Unfortunately, it seems like lack of funding for visuals is a major barrier. So Avesta is curious how you got involved and secured funding for these kinds of projects, and how you and whether or not you had to pitch the use of visuals or basically get lucky in finding researchers who value visuals and make extra room for them in their funding.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, it's a very good point. Depends where you are and what's going on. But I think the field of graphic medicine is growing. And so the kind of reason I've dedicated the last almost 4 years to being a part of the actual research conduct and publishing is to try and connect the academic spaces with or to generate evidence in the form that they like to read about this sort of material, and as well as to teach me what is the best way and places that I can use comics to support healthcare research and aims. So I think the more research that gets out there and the more excellent examples like the COVID-19 Chronicles, like Toby Morris and Susie Wiles, the more there is space for this. Within New Zealand, that Toby Morris, Susie Wiles collaboration has been incredibly popular, and it's kind of normalized comics being used to share science. And so there's more and more researchers here that are getting in touch, wanting that sort of material, seeing the sort of work that I do already, and getting me involved there. And I participated in an event called Drawing Science back in June, where they got a whole bunch of academic scientists who'd never worked with artists and a bunch of artists who are interested in sharing science that way. And I think it was 30 and 30, a reasonable crowd for that niche interest. And again, it's just spreading the idea that comics can be used in this way, and people are more accepting of it. So the sort of work that I've done for the Bristol Academic Respiratory Unit as well, they are building the budget for comics to support their research aims into the budget from the beginning, in the early stage. And the kind of header in the funding panel for that is under research translation. So yeah, trying to get, there's no point in doing all the research if you can't share it. And this section of funding applications is becoming a bigger and bigger deal, and it's becoming a mandatory requirement for them. So a lot of scientists are panicking, realizing, oh shit, I haven't really thought about how I can share it other than journals. What is beyond journals? And so we fit really nicely into this place of how can they disseminate their research, especially with public audiences. So all forms of medical art, that's the sort of section people can justify it under. And I'm seeing more and more that people are including us from the beginning in funding. And I think everyone says money is tight, their funding is an issue. And it's not really that's not really the case. The case is building it in from the start. And the more examples you have to share, both of your own work, your own social media presence, or other people who are doing a similar thing, the better. But I think that's changing, or that's certainly what I'm seeing on this side of the pond.
Cool. Great. Our next question is from Contessa, who says, firstly, thank you for your talk. You are super talented. And then
Pleasure.
She asks, what resources would you recommend for someone who is not a strong cartoon artist to learn how to draw cartoon art?
I also, there's going to be a little bit of imposter syndrome for everything. I showed you some of the examples that personally I think are unbelievable, and some people might look at some of my illustrations and say, but you render more, there's more detail, or maybe I think those illustrations are better. And everyone's got their own scale and standard, but I think the more efficiently you can communicate something, the better. And so examples like the COVID-19 Chronicles are beautiful for it. Look how simple you can be and how appealing it can be to share that information. But yeah, resources to learn comic art, it's I could point you at 101 textbooks, but to be honest, you just have to expose yourself to as many resources as you can. Make as many pictures as you can, study people you love or you like. I'll often, before I start a piece of work, I will make a collage illustration that I have up on one screen, which is the sort of style I want to aim for. So it's a big mash of all the artists that I love the work of. And it's not necessarily medical art. A lot of it's cartoons and comics, Studio Ghibli, like lots of fun, inspirational resources. And I don't know whether it works or not. It might be all psychological, but when you have that sort of inspiration nearby and you're stuck or you're trying to develop something, having a peek over, how would they do it can be really useful. But really, it's not the answer people like to hear, but it's just mileage. Is it Walt Stanchfield from Disney said, we've all got 10,000 bad drawings in us. The sooner you get them out, the better. And maybe multiply 10,000 by tenfold or further. You just keep making pictures. each time you make a picture, if you don't like it, that's far more useful than a picture you love. You don't learn from a picture you love, you learn from one that you don't. And you'll develop your eye for both your own work and everybody else's. And so look for the things that inspire you and that suit your aesthetic. Try things, copy things that work. No matter how hard you copy, you'll never do it as well as the person you're copying. And so lean on as many resources as inspire you and see what sticks, and it eventually absorbs into your own style.
Cool. Thank you. Those are great tips, and hopefully that answers Contessa's question. Our next question is from Victoria. How do you publish your academic studies on medical illustration? She's curious about the requirements.
Oh, thank you for that question, Victoria. Yeah, so I've, as I said, coming through a medical background when I was at medical school and the time after, and now working with the Medical Research Institute, I've probably been more fortunate than the average person for having opportunities to be involved in academic spaces. But it all probably started from me illustrating academic works for other people and being involved in those academic worlds. And then I've had more and more opportunities to do my own research. But really, if you have an idea, if you have something you want to publish on, there's a spectrum of research from an opinion piece about what you think or your personal experience, to case studies, to randomized controlled trials, survey-based research. There's a whole spectrum. But if you don't have a skill, reach out to people in those worlds that do. I've got I think I had it up on the slide, artibiotics.com/resources. I've got a list of a couple of journals that publish this sort of material, but really the field you're looking for is graphic medicine, and the Journal of Visual Communication and Medicine is one of those good ones. They're very open to any use of visuals in healthcare settings, and both it's a good place for us to read and learn what people have discovered with research, and also to share our own findings. And I would encourage everyone, whether you go through formal academic routes or share things on blogs and the like, please share your experiences, because you help the next person. It's a stepping stone as well. And we can all grow and learn from each other. I don't think there's a competition for that. Let's all evolve as quickly as we can and make the most useful work for the most amount of people. But yeah, share what you can, and we'll try and do the same.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we have a couple questions from the exec team, actually. I see that Nitai just raised his hand.
Yes, thank you. It was very beautiful, and yeah, I love all the drawings and the metaphors. So actually I have a question about what is your perspective of using visual metaphors and simplifying topics that potentially can cause people to, understand the concept in the wrong way. If you have examples that you encountered, and I guess from the scientific and medical doctors, if someone asks you to not use a specific metaphor.
Excellent question. First of all, I think it's all well and good for us to say about where we think things work really well, but it's also super important to learn where things aren't useful or don't work for every audience. So I imagine every single thing I've ever produced, there's going to be an audience and situation where it's not helpful and not useful. And it's good to be aware of those, or also aware that taken into different contexts, things may not be as useful as you'd hoped. First of all, I think metaphors are wonderful. It's one of the special things we can do with illustrations. We've got photography, radiology, video, all that. There's no point in reproducing reality. Our job is about trying to do what other forms of imaging and materials can't do. So metaphor, super useful, and in simplifying a concept, as you say, making it more memorable. I like to, where possible, try and use humor or surprising imagery that kind of makes an idea stick. Now, is metaphor might be the right word for it, but in New Zealand here, for one of our studies, I designed a series of stickers for the children that were in the study of different native birds here in New Zealand. The example here, there's one called a moorpork. It's a type of a cute little, or not a moorpork, is it a ruru? It's a very cute little owl, and it was one of the stickers that I included, like, oh, here's a cool New Zealand bird, you can choose the sticker after. But for Maori, the indigenous peoples of New Zealand, the moorpork is a symbol of death. So whereas in Europe, owls are kind of seen as like this intelligent creature that's really useful for sharing information, moorpork, not so good. And thankfully, the way to avoid these sorts of mistakes are you work, especially if you're not of the culture you're making resources for, or whenever you're serving resources for a multicultural environment, work with people from the cultures that you're trying to serve and listen to them as well. It's no good saying, oh, somebody looked at it and tick boxing that off, but genuinely listen to feedback. That has always been part of my process for these resources here. So it was picked up super early and avoided. And I'd read about a very similar issue in the past where someone tried to design resources in an oncology setting where they were trying to put out the idea, look, here's a clever little owl, learn more about your cancer condition. And what they were really saying to a large proportion of patients was, here's a symbol of death, let's talk about cancer. It was obviously a big faux pas or beyond that. Working with people from the audiences that you intend to serve is super important. And that can be patients, parents, children, make sure you listen to them as well. The earlier you can get that feedback in your design process, the better as well.
Thank you. It's
pleasure.
Okay, so I just want to acknowledge that we're at the top of the hour. There are a few more outstanding questions. Would you be willing to stay on for a couple more minutes to answer them?
Absolutely, no problem.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, so we have a question from Jenny on the exec team. Jenny, did you want to ask directly?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. That was really an amazing talk. So my question is from an experience of a medical illustrator. I always find it quite hard to design material for patients, especially for children, because I find it really hard to find the balance between making information that's too complicated versus making information that's so simplified that there could lead to misconceptions. And I want to ask, how do you navigate finding this balance?
How can I arrange my answer? I'll do it my usual verbal diarrhea, and hopefully there'll be a thread of logic within all of that. I come from a family of 6 children. I'm one of the oldest. I've been around lots of different ages of kids for a long time. Not to say that I'm an expert, but I think especially with my baby brother, just learned that kids are so much smarter than you think. And with all my work in the clinical trials with children recently as well, it's just I'm reminded of it every day. Now, it's hard because, there's a spectrum of understanding, and there are more reasons than age that might vary that understanding depending on someone's experience of education, the opportunities they've had, and so on. So it's tricky. I would err on the side of assuming kids are smarter than you think. It's hard, but if you have the opportunity, they don't have to be patients. You can find children through family, through friends. There are environments you can get real feedback, and you will be so surprised on the things that they notice, that they like, that they don't like, and very quickly. It's so much more useful than trying to guess and guesstimate and look at psychology research for what sort of developmental level is someone supposed to be at by X years of age. There's so much more to it than that. Put your pictures or materials in front of real kids, and you learn so much more. And it's not just about putting your material there and getting some feedback and going, shit, now I've got 400 things I need to change, or I need to redesign it from the beginning. You will enjoy that experience so damn much whenever you see the things that they really enjoy as well. I'm not sure if you can remember offhand, there was a picture of hypovolemia, of too little fluid in the body, that I showed, where it's an astronaut with a sword through them. There's blood coming out, they're vomiting, there's diarrhea. It's all the causes of hypovolemia we look for when someone's heart has given out, because they're all fixable if you can identify them. But it's a really weird illustration of an astronaut in a weird situation. And I mean, it was intended for emergency medicine registrars and medics who deal with people's hearts who've stopped. And in a recent study, I had this poster on the wall, and a kid came in and they got so distracted wanting to know every detail about what all of the pictures were in this poster. And they understood, like, even the wording, it's got all the medical Latin terms in it and stuff. And they were just fascinated. And it was, again, it wasn't designed for that audience. They absolutely loved it. And it was just so lovely, to be honest, seeing how your materials might be easily consumed by people you don't think can handle them, and vice versa. But yeah, if you have the chance to put it in front of kids, that's the way to. That's probably the most useful thing you can do.
That's lovely. Thank you so much. Can I ask a quick follow-up question, please?
Of course.
Through even just that astronaut example, and throughout a lot of work you showed us, there's been so many excellent analogies of medical processes and mechanisms. And I'm just curious, like, how do you come up with all these amazing analogies?
I'm a strange person. I really don't know any other way to do it. I'm quite a visual person, as I'm assuming most of us are, and yeah, I think a lot in analogy. Maybe it's scientific text, or the usual way of understanding things, is often complicated. And remember, I talked about that little moment when things click. That little clicky moment is often when I'm like, it's like blank, or and kind of all my way of seeing things is skewed by the things that I like, and you should lean into the things that you like. So I didn't touch on it here, but I also trained in video games development and worked in concept art for a little while. And so all of the way I approach art is skewed by their approach. Games people are always approaching things, trying to make things entertaining, making fun. And it's this little thing, 3-letter word, fun, is just kind of thrown around, and or it's not seen as important, but it can make such a difference in whether you engage with material or not. Like, let me go on a tangent for a second, but video games, you are getting people to engage with controllers, hardware, software. A new game is a complete different way of working. You're making people learn really complicated tactile movements to learn strategy, to learn the physics engine of a game, to learn stats points, and all these different things that are required for you to even be able to engage with that game. And games do a brilliant job of making you have no idea that you're learning all these complex physical and internal processes to be able to engage with them. You enjoy that experience, you come back for that experience, and you feel good about that experience before and after. This is what I mean when I'm talking about think about the experience of the people who receive or interact with our resources. And that perspective is a small shift, but if you can make something fun or entertaining or silly or memorable, it's such a leg up in just tricking people is the wrong thing, but you're making people look at that differently. But yeah, I've tangented a little bit, but yeah, if you can think about what would be a more fun way to say this, what would be a funnier way to say this, what is the simplest way I can express this idea. And I'll also start with a lot of mind maps. Maybe that's helpful to say. The first idea you come up with whenever someone says, here's the problem, can you make a visual? That's probably the same idea 90% of people are going to come up with to express that idea. And even if that's the idea you settle on, try and brainstorm past that. Go as abstract and tangential as you can. All the words that make up the pathology or the problem, learn about the problem, put the science in one corner, put all the visuals you can think of in the other, put all the analogies you can think of in another, put all of the ways someone else has explained it in another, put the things that you like and are interested in another, stew on it, come back to it, and then see how you can mix and match those, or what makes the most sense. But I'll often start with abstract ideas and words before I start putting pictures to paper.
Thank you so much.
If that means anything.
Fantastic answer, really. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for a good question.
All right. So we have 2 last questions, if that's okay.
Of course.
The first of which is from Alex. Alex, do you want to ask?
Yeah, go for it. Thank you for talking for us. with us for so long. Thank you for the incredible presentation. Mine is sort of like a practical question, I think, partially in terms of the work that you're doing in terms of the illustrations, and also a little bit with how you post them onto social media. So I think going through, obviously, like everyone else, I was like wildly impressed by the quality of the work that you're doing, but also by like the volume of it. And one of the things I noticed was how you like very cleverly were repurposing posts that I've seen on Instagram, things that I've seen on Twitter, for some of those posters and for some of those paper illustrations as well. So I'm just curious about the thought process that goes into when you're creating a piece, and then how you can reuse it elsewhere to sort of get as much out of it as you can.
I'm going to preface this. Well, I bloody hate the way social media works and tries to, and I will say that the way you see anybody you think is interesting, or any artist posting in social media, is a hand cherry-picked selection of things. They may look like they post every day. They may look like they have infinite outputs, but please, it's so depressing to look like that. So please understand the way most people will do things is you repost content you've made a long time ago, you repurpose. Yep, see how clever you can be about reformatting art, even if you have to like change the proportions, extend it, do a little more work on it, or change it in future. Like I've gone back to many illustrations and changed things about them as I feel like my skills have gone up, and it's new work to put out there and share. You can use software to schedule things in advance, so that you're not posting every day or every week or even every month. And I will tell you, anyone that actually sees when things post from me, there can be great variability from a shitload of posts that just happen to work at once to months of absolutely zero action. So there is a spectrum, and please, nobody, don't read too much into anybody's online appearance, because it's depressing for all of us. And some people have really insane, wonderful output, but it's incredibly rare. Now, I think I'm losing track of the question because I've gone too far with that prelude. Can you just remind me again? It's about planning social media for planning and reusing art. That was the
yeah. I think also everything you said was like spot on as well. But I think if there's any thought like as to how you might go about that when you're doing it, or is it a little bit more of a natural process, I guess, like you mentioned?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. So a lot of my work is led by, the main job. You need your income. You need the work that lets you survive and thrive. And so a lot of it is led by, I create work for whatever purpose it's needed. And I'm always thinking, though, as I'm making it, how might I share this when it finally comes out of NDA or becomes appropriate for me to do? And often, for like the work with radiographics, I will often come up with two ideas, and I will, with the co-authors that I work with in those articles, I will render one out in full while pitching another. And when the other one isn't pitched, but I really like it, I will go on and develop it in my own time. So I'm not starting from scratch. I'm extending an idea by extra work that I put in. So sometimes there's that idea. Often in the kind of concept art games approach, you develop lots of pitches and only one of them is developed. I'll develop other ideas or share other ideas in their earlier stages also. Often things like comics and more complicated illustrations can be broken up in different ways. So I might think that it's useful in one context for one audience to share it, for example, with no labels or with an animated section or something. So there's a lot of ways you can reuse the sort of work that you do. But what I would say is to be careful not to never do it for the sake of it. Like you can change the color 100 times and make 1,000 versions of the same thing, but always have a purpose for the way that you tweak things and change things. Always thinking about what is useful for this platform, for this audience, what is different about this art now. So those are some ways you might, extend the life, give new life to work, and often I will build comics around more complex illustrations and leave the more complex illustrations in their extra detail and leave the comic portions that connect them in a rougher style. So there are ways to make that make sense. Don't burn yourself out.
Thank you so much.
All right, and our last question for the evening is going to be from Marcus. Marcus, did you want to come off of mute and ask your question?
Sure, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep,
Yes.
can hear you.
Awesome. So yeah, again, thank you for the presentation. Really amazing. And just going back a couple of questions. I recall someone asking about, or you bringing up how the importance of working with other people, especially when you're working with generally diverse or underrepresented populations, for example, like the indigenous populations, for example. And I'm finding myself in the very same boat where I'm starting a project where I'm trying to create vaccination health promotion with what do you call that? A country in South Africa, and I'm kind of running the same errors. And I'm trying to think about what was the kind of process or procedure, like kind of like big questions that you want to ask your partner when you're trying to reach out to these populations and like make something that's more culturally appropriate and culturally reflects their context, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll rehammer the main point that I wanted to share before, and that is just, come with a very open mind. Start from the position that you do not understand. If you're not part of that culture, you will never understand it. No matter how much reading or research or anything you try to do, you won't understand it properly. And if you start from that position, you're in a very open space to the feedback and learning about that culture and what might make something appropriate. Then there's I guess a couple of things to say. One, first of all, work with people from that culture. So hopefully the people that have hired you will either be of the culture that's relevant or be able to put you in touch with people. If they don't, it's your job to try and find people. And I know that can be quite difficult working across language and geographic boundaries. But it's incredibly important to get that feedback. So a lot of the work that I do, we either work directly with partners in from the different kind of ethnic makeup within New Zealand, and where that hasn't been possible within the Institute, I've sought those collaborations elsewhere. So looking towards community organizations. For example, we've got a wonderful organization locally called Tukotahi Māori Asthma Trust, who do a lot of work in the community, and they're very open to discussing and reviewing resources, and have been just a well of they've been unbelievably important in shaping resources that are appropriate, and not just appropriate, but useful to these audiences. And it can be small things, it can be big things, but yeah, just seek relevant people to make those decisions or to give that support. I would also caveat that with for anyone getting any feedback from any other people that are involved in any project, one person's feedback is not necessarily their word isn't always going to be right. A lot of people are really good at finding the problem, but not good at articulating how to solve it as well. And that's especially difficult whenever they're maybe not visually oriented. But what I say is if you can get feedback from multiple people, and especially the actual end users rather than the people maybe hiring you for work, that sort of feedback you might listen to more. And if you start hearing an idea repeating from multiple sources, you know that you need to listen to that more as well. So there's a pinch of salt. You don't have to dogmatically listen to everything, every bit of feedback you get, but really be sensitive whenever you're not familiar with that audience, and whenever you start hearing ideas more than once and expressed in different ways. And sometimes for you to understand it, you need to hear it in different ways as well. So that's kind of what I would say. And just to empathize, it is difficult. What is appropriate also changes over time. What's appropriate for one person might not be for another. So just the widest feedback you can get from relevant people is incredibly important and will lead to more useful resources for the people who need them.